Hi there, and welcome to the latest episode of Off the Data Provided, an interpersonal communication podcast. I'm, of course, your host, Dr. Marcus C. Shepard. On today's episode, we're just going to focus on 3 terms that have really taken hold of the zeitgeist since we really delved into online communication, internet dating, even internet friendships. And so those terms are, of course, ghosting, orbiting, and breadcrumbing. I thought this would be a great short episode to engage with because these terms always come up. I'm at the beginning of my new semester with some of my interpersonal communication students, and we're already talking about some of these concepts when we talk about investment, emotional closeness, trust, support, and how these things can definitely get in the way. So after we talk through these concepts, how they appear in both relational contexts of friendships as well as romantic relationships, we will engage with an Ask Dr. Shepard, which is from a new student of mine who's looking for advice on how to make friends as the new semester has begun. So with that said, delving into those terms, ghosting, orbiting, and breadcrumbing, I think it's always important to kind of have some baseline definitions of them. And I'm sure you're probably familiar with ghosting and maybe orbiting, but it's going to be helpful just to have a understanding. So ghosting is essentially the practice of ending a personal relationship with someone by withdrawing without any explanation or communication. So you've been talking, you've been texting, you've been engaging with one another, and then maybe you send a text or you send a call, they don't pick up, they don't respond, and maybe you don't think anything of it. You might text them another day or in a few hours and they don't respond, and they essentially just either leave you on red if they have their read receipts on or do not respond at all. So we know that ghosting has really kind of exploded with our engagements online. So it's definitely a term that kind of originates in the early 2000s, typically when it's about dating. But we see that ghosting also occurs with friendships, right? Early nascent friendships. Sometimes if things don't go a certain way, they end. So ghosting is something I think most people are readily familiar with. It's kind of been in the lexicon, I want to say since about 2015 or so. And we know, for instance, that about 81% of people who have ghosted did so because they quote unquote weren't into the person they ghosted. And 64% of these people said that they ghosted because the person did something they disliked, and stated that 25% said that they were angry with that person. And this, of course, is from a BuzzFeed article that explores 8 reasons people ghost. So whenever we talk about ghosting, especially in my interpersonal communication course, I always harp on the fact that ghosting is oftentimes unethical. I always challenge them to provide me a reason why someone would ghost. And the only reason I believe that is justifiable is, of course, in cases of abuse, right? You need to get away. But we know that, for instance, from the BuzzFeed article, the 8 reasons why people ghost, right? First, it's they're just not that into you. Well, it's worth then sharing with someone that you're not invested or interested in them anymore. I always share this with friends when we've talked about dating and they're in the early stages, that if you've moved past a certain point, you at least owe it to tell that person that you're not interested. Now, the reason why I feel like you don't need to say, and I always bring up an example of a friend that didn't necessarily ghost me, but early friend that I was fostering a relationship with while I was here in Philadelphia. And the friend told me he didn't want to be friends with me anymore. And so, of course, my ego wanted to know, well, why? What is it that makes you not want to be my friend anymore? But at that point, I had reached a certain maturity level where I said, great, no issue. I wish you all the best. And I ended it there. I never engaged with that person again. I unfollowed them on social media. They still followed me, would watch my stories. When I joined a new social media network, they followed me there. And so I felt that was odd because you clearly said you weren't interested in being part of my life anymore. And that, of course, will bring us to that next concept of orbiting. And we'll talk about that after we get through these 8 reasons why people potentially ghost. right? The second reason people claim that they ghost is they got too busy. And in this case, dating stopped being a priority. And so that can happen in early courtships. Maybe you feel like you have the time or space or bandwidth to date, and maybe you find out you don't. But if that's the case, if you've invested enough time to get to know somebody, and for me, if you have had a meaningful conversation, not a texting conversation, you've been texting on an app or on a social media platform and then decide, that I think is a gray area. And of course, I don't like gray, but I think that's a gray area and we can see it going different ways. But if we've exchanged numbers, we've talked on the phone, and even more importantly, if you've actually met in person, had a physical interaction, then even if you're too busy, I do still think you should let that person know, hey, I thought I had the bandwidth to date. It's not working out. We also know that sometimes people feel like too much time has passed. So maybe you had a scheduled phone call and you both forgot about it, or things got too busy, but then you didn't arrange for a rain check. And so it's maybe easier to just let that relationship go than to address that silence. And for me, depending on the length as well as the depth of that connection, I think you still, that person warrants to know that, hey, you're not interested anymore, or I feel like too much time has passed. I'm in a different space. Maybe you are too. Maybe you're talking to other people now, or I am, but just to clear the air that it's not, right? What's the worst that's going to happen? They don't respond back to you, right? The ghost, you ghost them and they ghost you in turn. I also know, right, the article talks about the fourth reason is they couldn't see it working out. And so they believe, okay, it's not going to go anywhere. So if it's not going to go anywhere, then I might as well just stop talking to this person. It's not their fault. It's not really my fault, but the connection's not leading anywhere. But I think as an adult, as hopefully more ethical and effective communicators, you can at least let that person know, hey, I've thought about our connection and I've realized that it's not really going to move forward. The fifth, of course, reason is the interpersonal landscape of dating makes it easy, right? So it's just easy. Oh, I will just unmatch. Or texting is impersonal, and I didn't really feel that close of a connection. So we never really moved or migrated from that impersonal form of communication. So it is what it is. And I think that if something has shifted or changed, you still should just let that person know. I think instead of allowing that person, if you've ever been on the receiving end of being ghosted, sometimes your mind wanders. Well, what did I do? Did I say something? Is something about me that turned this person off? And maybe it was, or maybe it wasn't, as we've started to highlight some of these other reasons that sometimes don't even have anything to do with the person that you're talking to. So it's going to be important to hopefully be more ethical and effective and just let that person know. Another type of reason why that people argue is it's baked into different attachment styles. So if you have an anxious attachment style or an avoidant attachment style, this might be a type of mode of how you may communicate. Still doesn't mean that it's right. We also know 7, it has to do with timing. So some people may feel that they don't owe the other person anything, including a conversation, explaining why the relationship has ended, because the amount of time that they were seeing each other, it doesn't feel as if they've invested a lot of time or emotions into the relationship, so they don't feel as if they need to explain. And I still don't agree with that. If we've exchanged a meaningful conversation, if there were hopes in fostering a type of interpersonal relationship, whether it be platonic or romantic or sexual, and we just no longer feel that way, then it's easy just to let somebody know. I always say the why is not important, but at least letting them know that you're not interested. And if they still want to communicate and figure out the why, then I think you're within your right to not communicate further, but just letting them know, hey, I'm no longer interested in communicating. I think that is the best way to go about it. And then the last reason why, or one of the most common reasons they say, is that it may have experienced a trigger. So certain people can bring up different emotions in other people's that acts as triggers. And so they feel as if they continue to talk to that person, or if they weren't honest with that person, it could not be safe for them. And so I think this is a gray area, and also goes along with that kind of assault or abuse reason why. And that's really the only reason why I've ever believed that it maybe is ethical to do it. Is it effective? Sure, on your part, it's effective, but it's probably also not effective on the other person's part. They might just think you're busy, so they might still contact you for a bit. Where if you just would have told them that you're no longer interested, it might have stopped. And so I know what I do, or what I used to do, is I don't really engage in this behavior anymore, right? I'm not in these spaces where ghosting could occur. But when I was out dating, I would send a preemptive text to people oftentimes when I feel like they were pulling away, where let's say we were texting every day and then the text became a little less frequent. Maybe now it's every few days, now it's once a week. And once I realized a change in behavior, I would just say, hey, I feel as if I'm sensing a change in behavior. If you're busy or things have happened, and that's the reason why, I'd love for you to just open up about that, and I totally get it. If it's because you're no longer interested, I also understand that. It's been a pleasure getting to know you briefly, and I wish you all the best. But if you are still interested, and it's not because of any of these reasons, then please step it up, because I've noticed a change in your behavior. And I'd say 9.9 times out of 10, honestly, really 10 times out of 10, I wouldn't get a response back. But what would happen then, and brings us into kind of orbiting / breadcrumbing, is several months later, the person would hit me up. And I would sometimes say, see prior text, right? I'd let you know that I felt that there was a shift in our communication. And if that wasn't your intent, I gave you the opportunity to remedy that, to explain that away. Hell yeah, no, I got really busy at work, or yeah, you're right, I'm not interested in you. You didn't provide that, but now you're interested in contacting me again. No, thank you. And so I talked to one of my best friends about this recently. And I used to be the person that even if you hit me years later, right? And it's famously years later for me with people, picture of me might go a little viral or would come across their screen, and I would get a random text message. I don't delete text message threads. I just delete your number. So I would get a message from a number that wasn't saved, and I would scroll up and see the prior conversation, be like, oh, this was someone I used to talk to years ago. What has happened? Oh, a photo of mine has been getting a lot of traction on Instagram or on Twitter. Okay, this photo probably came across their timeline, and they're interested in reconnecting potentially, or just seeing if they have access to me. So what I do now is I just don't respond. Right? Leave me where you left me is kind of my motto with that. And I think for everyone, it's important to figure out what you feel comfortable with. Maybe you don't feel comfortable kind of doing the preemptive ghost texting like I feel comfortable with, but I'm also not in the dating sphere anymore. So if that's not something you feel comfortable with, I think that's fine. But figure out what works best for you to hopefully engage with this in a more ethical and effective way. So if you're someone who's guilty of ghosting people, I would say take a step back. Have you liked when you've been ghosted? I would probably argue you didn't. And so then why would you want someone to feel that way? And so with that, hopefully you work through some of those feelings. And on the flip side, if you've been someone that's continually been ghosted, well, how can I take some ownership of this situation? For me, it was the preemptive ghosting text message and engaging sometimes with them when they pop back up with the orbiting or the breadcrumbing, and just letting them know where they had me messed up at, right? Like, no, I'm not going to engage. So now what I do fully, right, is literally someone hit me up 2 weeks ago who I talked to years ago. I guess a photo of mine crossed their timeline or whatever. Somehow they thought of me and they just texted, hey. And I was like, who is this? And I scrolled back and I was like, oh, this is someone I was talking to years ago. And the reason why the communication fell off was because there didn't seem to be any impetus to move out of texting, right? We were kind of stuck in this loop when I would push to meet up or push to make plans to hang out. So cool, leave me where you left me. So of course, that brings up, as I said, the other concepts of orbiting and ghosting. Orbiting and breadcrumbing. So orbiting, of course, is when someone usually stops that direct communication with you, aka ghosting, but they continue to engage with you virtually. So maybe they're still following you on social media, they're watching your stories, they're liking your posts, maybe they'll leave a little message, maybe they'll DM you from time to time. So the key components of this is there's more so a digital presence, nothing physical. So they stay connected to you online. There's a lack of real contact. So there's no calls, no texts, no plans while they're present maybe in your online life. They might also send you mixed signals. So they might send confusing messages to you or sending confusing messages to other people who you associate with. And why people orbit oftentimes, we know that sometimes they have difficulty moving on, so they might still have feelings or find it hard to cut ties completely, so they want to monitor you. There's also that curiosity aspect, so they want to know what you're doing, what you're up to, who you're doing it with. So I know I've had several people who have orbited, right? They're the reason why they ended communication with me. And then they're still following me, they're still engaging, they're still doing these light kind of check-ins. They also might do it for control. So keeping you in their quote unquote orbit can be a way to maintain control with you as a potential option. So to keep you on that back burner. So sure, we're not talking right now, but I still have maybe access to you. Don't want that, hopefully. And then we know people get these kind of dopamine hits where small interactions can provide kind of quick emotional boosts. So I flirt or I slide in your DMs and you respond, oh, that feels nice, right? Even though I treated this person maybe badly or I ended our communication, they're still responding to me or they're still flirting back with me. Okay, I like that. And so, of course, orbiting differs from ghosting because it's not a complete disappearance. There's this digital presence. And it's a little different than breadcrumbing because breadcrumbing, as we'll get into, is kind of occasional, minimal, intentional engagements that keep hope alive, where orbiting is more passive. It's kind of watching, though you can maybe touch base once in a while. So I know a perfect example of someone that had orbited my life for a while, but that kind of shut down was they would always follow me on social media. They would always like my posts. And maybe once a year or so, they just say something in the DMs, right? Or they'd slide in the DM. But it was kind of like clockwork. And so it wasn't breadcrumbing because it wasn't as frequent. That's what I would say is maybe the slight difference. But still, as we can maybe tell, is unethical and is ineffective, right? It's kind of not cutting someone out completely. It is moving in this gray space and gray area, which some people love to live and exist in. I know for me, I prefer more black and white engagements. You know, to each his, her, or their own. But to me, especially at this age, I like to just know explicitly where I stand with people, or if you really like me, or if you don't like me, if you're interested in me, if you're not interested in me. I don't do that gray area. So I know even some people I follow on social media who I don't particularly know. I'm thinking about one instance in particular, someone who maybe appears to be interested in me, but doesn't really give me anything. And so maybe if I was younger or maybe a little more naive, I might be hooked on that orbiting, or we'll delve into what breadcrumbing is. But it's important for you to know and understand that these are not really positive ways to engage with any interpersonal relationship. So of course, we've been focused somewhat on the romantic, but people do this in platonic ways as well. So as I said, for me, with that example of that former friend who said, hey, I don't want to be your friend anymore, we totally ended communication, but he was still orbiting. When I joined, as I said before, joined a different social media platform, he was one of the first people to follow me, which was a little confusing to me because 2 years before that, he said he didn't want to be my friend anymore. So I'm like, if you don't want to be my friend anymore, why do you want to follow me on this social media platform? And oh, by the way, it's been like 2 years since we've even communicated. That was odd to me. And so that brings us, of course, to breadcrumbing, which more people associate with dating, but I can maybe see arguments made for seeing this in platonic relationships as well. And so breadcrumbing is where someone is inconsistent They kind of give you minimal attention, maybe sporadic text messages, some social media likes, and they're not intending to build a real relationship. They're essentially just trying to keep you on the hook with these crumbs, right? That's why it's called breadcrumbing, right? They're these small crumbs, if you think about leaving crumbs out for a mouse to follow into the mousetrap, right? That's essentially what they're doing, right? They're leaving crumbs, and they hope that while they're avoiding commitment from you, that these small little acts will make you feel as if they're interested, right? But they're really just leaving you oftentimes confused and hurt. Some people would say it's emotional manipulation, where one person is providing just enough to maintain interest without any real investment, and that leads to false hope from that other party. So they're giving you just enough to feel as if they're interested in you, but they're not willing to commit too much or to anything. So we know that sometimes they show interest in making plans, but there's no firm commitment. They'll send mixed signals, which leaves you confused. So maybe they're hot one moment, then cold the next. They have small but inconsistent interests and flirty behaviors, but don't follow through. So for me, I think about DMs on social media. Sometimes, maybe people do a hard eyes or say something maybe suggestive sexually or flirty towards you, but then there's no real follow through after that. These people also maybe ignore or delay responses to your messages or calls. They literally oftentimes put in little, if no effort into investing into the relationship. They oftentimes keep options open by maintaining contact not just with you, but with a multitude of other people. They usually lack accountability and are sometimes reluctant, to define what the relationship is or discuss future plans. And they also may create the illusion of care and interest, but then respond infrequently or with superficial answers. So you're not getting to the meat of the bones of anything here, right? It's very surface level. It's flashy. If it feels like something, I would say maybe it's fast food. It's those fast food conversations or engagements where you feel satisfied, but then let's say you go for a walk and then you're going to get hungry again. The meal didn't fully satisfy you, but you feel satisfied in the moment. So sure, maybe you talk on the phone for 20 minutes and then they have another call coming in and they say they'll call you right back, and then they never do. And then you don't hear from them for a few weeks. And then they pop back up and like, oh, I'm so sorry that happened. Like, I just got really busy. How have you been? I've been missing you. I've been thinking about you, right? Just pull you right back in. So we want to be mindful and aware of this type of behavior. So other signs that we know is they make you feel important, but they're going to respond to you inconsistently. They talk about making plans, but they never firm up dates. So I know newer friends that I've made in the past, right, who are no longer my friends. They'd say, oh, I miss you. Let's talk. And I'm like, okay, well, when do you want to talk? When are you free? Right? Okay, let's put some firm dates on the board. And then I wouldn't hear anything. Okay. Sometimes they ignore or change the topic when you try to make plans, right? Because they're not actually interested in hanging out with you or developing this type of relationship. We also know that their actions don't match their words. So, okay, you say you miss me and you want to talk to me or you want to hang out, but now I'm putting in effort to try and do that, but you're not. Okay, a disconnect. And we also know sometimes they only compliment you when they want something from you. This is a famous tactic I've experienced from different people. And I've talked about this, I believe, on the podcast, but definitely in my classes, where I'm the type of person that if you need something from me and we haven't communicated in a little while, I just prefer that you tell me that you need something and what it is. And I either will say yes or no. I don't like when you try and butter me up or be like, oh my God, it's been so long we haven't talked. I was just thinking about you. Let's talk. And then we're talking. And then towards the end of the conversation, it's a hook because, oh, you need something from me. Well, we could have just saved 20, 30 minutes because it's clear you didn't really actually care how I was doing. You just needed to see if I was willing or able to provide this service or this opportunity or loan you money, whatever you want to do. And then we also know that, especially romantically, right, they oftentimes flirt but will never ask you out. So you might experience this especially on social media or some dating platforms, right? You match with these people, you're having great conversations, but it's never leading anywhere. Or then communication dwindles a bit, then maybe you try and pick it back up and it starts going a bit, but you try and move it offline and never fully gets realized. So this has become a larger issue in our global interpersonal communication existence because we are heavily relying on social media, on technology to foster a lot of relationships. There have been countless articles written about the death of third spaces where you would oftentimes just run in or meet random people. So we know that the majority of people are meeting people online, on social media, on dating apps, for friends, for romantic interests. And so these signs of ghosting, of breadcrumbing, of even orbiting are clearly not healthy things to do. And if we are truly invested in fostering stronger ties and building community, because a lot of people complain about lack of community, these are things we have to remove, right? We need to be accountable to our actions. We need to hopefully just not ghost in general. Just tell someone, hey, I was interested in being your friend, as that person told me, but I'm no longer interested. Great. Cool. We moved on. He, though, was still orbiting me on different social media platforms. So I know one in particular, I removed him right on Instagram. I was like, okay, we agreed not to be friends anymore. I unfriended you, but you're still following me. You're still watching my stories. Why is that? You said you didn't want to be my friend. So why do you even want to view what I'm doing? So I just removed him. And I don't believe he followed me back after being removed. So that hopefully solved that issue. And then with breadcrumbing, right, as I've said before, right, I've experienced that, or even maybe the long-term orbiting where they pop up every few years. And what I used to do, as I shared with you, would be to engage. And so now I don't engage at all because from my point of view, sometimes they're just breadcrumbing or orbiting just to see if they have access to you, if you're still going to respond or engage with them. And they've shown you that they don't have much respect for you for how they treated you. And so I know Iyanla Vanzant famously said, right, I don't give you the permission to disrespect me. And so for me, I'm not giving you that permission, so I'm not going to respond to you anymore. I remember talking with a friend about this where she was like, oh, well, I always want to be available just in case they need me. And as I told her, why is that your concern? Because they've been engaging and talking to and fostering relationships with all these other people when they left you at the side of the road. So now in their darkest hour, they're coming to you. Why can't they come to other people? And that relates back to a viral text message I shared a few years ago with someone I was getting to know from social media. We had literally exchanged numbers, right? We had liked kind of similar music, video games, thought we could form friendship. And he kind of ghosted me for 3 weeks and then popped up and was like, oh, I've been going through it. You're always great with words of wisdom. Can you provide that? And I said, no, I'm not going to provide that. You can seek that from the other people you've been investing and fostering in these last 3 weeks. Right? And he said, you know what? You're right. I'm so sorry. Da, 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 da. And we ceased communication. Right? So I think it's always important to figure out what feels right to you, being this person that has been ghosted or being orbited or being breadcrumbed. And then on the flip side, if you're someone that's guilty of this behavior, well, why is it? And interrogate why you are doing it. And ideally, commit to not doing that anymore. I remember I got one friend who was guilty of ghosting, and then he was like, I tried it your way, and I told the person I wasn't interested, but then they were like, well, why am I not interested? And he was like, it just devolved. And I said, listen here, you tell someone you're not interested, then you can move on. I said, now, if you don't ever want to respond, if you want to block their number, if you want to do all that, I think that's fine because you've been ethical enough and effective enough to tell them you're not interested anymore. To me, the why you're not interested, especially in these early stages where this happens, this kind of, if it's platonic, these nascent friendship stages, or in the dating phase, kind of that talking phase, if it happens there, right? You're not as entrenched or enmeshed together that just saying, I'm not interested, to me is ethically and effectively enough of a reason to say it. Now, to go further into the why, of course, if you've had let's say you've actually been dating this person for several months and have been going on dates, hanging out, it's become more sexual. Yes, they deserve a why. But maybe you've gone on 2 coffee dates, or you went to the movies for a date, and maybe you went bowling, but it hasn't really progressed that far. Just saying, I'm not interested anymore, to me is enough. So those are kind of the 3 concepts of ghosting, orbiting, breadcrumbing, how we see them. Of course, it's important to unpack these terms because as we become more entrenched online, these behaviors become normalized. And for me, as an interpersonal communication professor, we shouldn't normalize these behaviors, right? They aren't ethical behaviors, except, right, as I said in ghosting, right, I can understand it being ethical when you are in an abusive situation. You need to fully remove yourself. I have no issue with that. I would never say that's unethical. And even on the effective side, I don't actually think any of these are truly effective either, because it leaves the other party thinking about other things. And so if we're trying to be more ethical and effective with our communication, we want to hopefully remove these practices from our lexicon if we're guilty of them. And I would probably argue we all have been guilty of doing this at least once in our lives. And I would probably argue probably more than once. I know I've probably ghosted 1 or 2 people back in the day, right? Guilty as charged, but I don't do that anymore, nor would I. So those are the concepts I just wanted to cover a little more in depth. I know we have referenced them briefly on other podcasts, but this podcast, of course, has focused on those. And so now we will move into the Ask Dr. Shepard. So this week's Ask Dr. Shepard comes from a new student of mine, and not to read what they necessarily said, but essentially it's a new semester. They don't have many friends, and they're looking to figure out ways on fostering new friendships and relationships in school. And so, as I always say, what's helpful to do that is, at the beginning of class, usually people get there a little early. That's the perfect moment to have that social snacking, those small little chats that you have with people. Just, oh, how's your day? How's the semester going? What classes are you liking, right? Not conversation that is really deep in self-disclosure and emotional vulnerability, but it's a way to break the ice. And so if you start having those small little conversations, those can slowly build into deeper conversations. If you're in one of my classes, if it's not my public speaking class, but all my other classes, you have group projects in all of my classes, which I do to help foster hopefully some friendships or some meaningful relationships, because you're going to be spending time with these people. So use those opportunities to talk to people. I always stress in my courses that part of being in the group is, yes, doing the work, but also just getting to know one another, seeing if there are commonalities, similar interests, things where you can foster more meaningful relationships. I know in one of my classes a few years ago, their group actually became very close, and one of the students was pregnant, and she invited them all to her baby shower, and they actually went. And I hope that some of them are still maintaining those relationships, but I, of course, have lost contact with those students, but I hope they haven't lost contact with each other. So clearly, right, put yourself out there. Also, we know when we're ever trying to move from a social role to a nascent friendship, it's going to be important to provide that opportunity. And what I mean by that is, if you're just a classmate and you're looking to maybe be more than a classmate and you're liking this person's vibe, ask them to do something outside of class, which will remove you from the classmate label. So depending on when your class meets, maybe you can get lunch before. Hey, do you want to meet up and just get lunch before class or after class? Or, hey, we both like this thing. I heard that this, maybe it's music, right? I heard that this artist is coming to town. Do you want to go with me, right? These are just extensions to see if they're interested in existing outside of that social role of classmate. And then the last thing I would suggest is, we are on campus. I know on our college campus, we have different clubs, and oftentimes they have their advertisements hung up throughout the buildings. And so I would try and find a club or 2 that you're interested in and attend those meetings, whether they're virtual or in person, and try and foster some relationships that way. That's kind of the way I know I made a lot of friends in undergrad, was going to different clubs and joining those clubs. And then my friends came from those clubs. Also, friends came from being in my major, right? And we always had those same type of classes. So it's a new semester. It might be your first semester, or maybe it's your second semester on campus. And it's never too late to make those moves, transitions, and hopefully foster friendships. So that is the episode for this week. Thank you all for tuning in. As always, if you do have an Ask Dr. Shepard, feel free to email me at offthedataprovided@gmail.com. Once again, that is offthedataprovided@gmail.com. And I will see you all on the next one. Have a good night.